so great to see all of you here. I think it's wonderful that this food system e-course is attended by so many different great agri-food professionals from around the globe, and I'm always happy to be part of it. My name is Just Tengerink. I'm working as food system advisor at Wageningen Social and Economic Research, and I'm coordinating this module about food system analysis. For today, we have a program with two guest speakers. First, my colleague, Helena Postumus, who is a senior food systems and policy advisor, also at Wageningen Social Economic Research, will tell you a bit more about the role of systems thinking in understanding food systems. So how can we analyze food systems in a better way, making use of systems thinking? And what does that bring us in terms of practical insights for our work? So I think that's the first presentation we'll have. And the second presentation is by Bram Peters. Bram Peters is working at University of Oxford as the Food Systems Program facilitator. And he will tell a bit more about a very specific example of a food system analysis in Myanmar of a couple of years ago. And he will show us how different elements of food system analysis can be implemented in practice. And for now, I think I'll give it over to Helena to introduce herself and yeah, bring us along in the journey of food system analysis.
Thank you, Just, for the introductions. And I will share my presentation. And hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to meet you all here in this virtual space. Yeah, I always find it a bit strange to be with so many in one place virtually, and at the same time, it's also amazing that we can do this. So in my presentation, I want to zoom out a little bit and talk a bit more about theory, and I hope you will be able to follow what I'm trying to explain, because sometimes it's very abstract and not always very tangible. But I think it's important to talk about systems thinking when we talk about food systems, because it's really about putting up a different lens or perspective to analyze or look at problems and understand what's going on. In my own work and my own career since 2000, in the last 5-6 years or so, we've been reflecting, and also jointly with Just and other colleagues, on if we have a food system lens, what does it actually mean in terms of what do we analyze? How do we approach problems to understand it? And based on all that thinking and that work and trying and making mistakes and trying again, we produced a food system decision support toolbox, which is basically a guide, a toolbox that we developed to inspire you to analyze food systems. It's not a blueprint, but it's to give you some ideas, some entry points about food system analysis. What is it and how can you actually implement that? And then I'll have some final thoughts on food system approach, when to use it, when not to use it. So that will be the main blocks in my presentations. And to introduce you, and probably on the platform, the learning platform, you already looked at some definitions and the concepts, but to make sure that we're all on the same page, for this course, I define a food system as all elements and activities from production to consumption, as well as markets and institutions that govern the system. Now, you may think this is very similar to the definition of a value chain. It also goes from farm to fork, from production through to processing and selling, marketing and consumption. But I think the difference between a value chain approach and a food system approach is that with a food system analysis, we also very much focus on the outcomes of the food system, which is not only food and nutrition security, but can also be socioeconomic and environmental outcomes. So socioeconomic outcome could be, do people earn a livelihood, an income that will allow them to pay their expenses? Or what about inequality and equity within the food system? Environmental outcomes, we can talk about pollution, or how do we protect biodiversity in our agricultural or rural areas. So the food system approach has a bit of a broader, more holistic scope than a value chain approach. And when we talk about food system actors, these are all the actors that play a part in a food system. So that depends on or are involved in a food system. So it's farmers, yes, processors, yes, but also consumers. So as we are all consumers and we are all citizens, all of us are an actor in a food system, and sometimes we play different roles as a person, as an individual. I play a role as a researcher, I play a role as a consumer, a citizen, who may advocate for certain priorities that I find important, that I value, whether it's equality or whether it's the environment. So each one of us is active in the food system. There's no one on this planet who's not part of a food system, because we all need to eat, right? So that at least. So the food system approach tries to have a holistic view, looking at different issues, different private and public goods. I think that is also important to stress, that the public goods, like the environment, like public health, social issues, are part of the food system analysis, but all linked to how we consume food, how we process food, how we produce food. It also tends to emphasize more on the policy aspects and the government aspects rather than the technical aspects, although that could be part of the analysis or the solution. So if you would try to map a food system, if you want to include everything, it gets very complicated, because we're talking about technology, we're talking about climate, we're talking about geopolitics, we're talking about animals, plants, people. So it can be very bewildering and complex as such. So on the one hand, I like this picture. It tries to be comprehensive, but at the same time, you get lost in this picture. What am I looking at? Where do I start? What is the issue here? How do I analyze it? And how do I come to solutions to certain problems that I want to solve? Here in Wageningen, colleagues try to create a slightly more a bit simplistic, well, maybe simplistic is not the right word, but a picture that tries to categorize the main elements of a food system that is a bit easier to understand. But I think that the trick is a little bit that with a food system approach or analysis, really the starting point are the outcomes, which you see on the right. Because the aim is to have food and nutrition security for a population or a country. It depends what level you look at. It could be a city, it could be a certain population group. But not only food and nutrition security, but also socioeconomic outcomes and environmental outcomes. And you could think, for example, of the sustainable development goals that we feel are important and that we try to achieve. So how can a food system contribute to those goals and objectives that we have? And when we recognize there is an issue in the outcomes, either we have to deal with loss of biodiversity or pollution, or food and nutrition security is a problem, or we are struggling with inequality. From that point, we try to reason backwards, like what happens in that food system that results in these outcomes, and what can we change or transform in the food system to make sure that the outcomes will also change. So that is sort of the food system approach, what it tries to achieve. And of course, there is the value chain that you can see here with the food supply system, but there's also an enabling environment. There are service providers, there are socioeconomic drivers, there are environmental drivers. These all have influence on what happens with how our food is being produced, made available, and what the outcomes of that whole system are. I hope you can still follow me, but this is the easiest. I'm trying to sort of paint a picture of a food system. What do we mean with that? Now, I want to take a step back and explain a little bit about systems thinking, what it is, where it comes from, and why it is important when we talk about food systems. And one of the concepts to explain is the concept of wicked problems. And this is sort of a simplified sheet, but if we, for example, a simple problem could be here in the Netherlands, we often take our bikes to go from A to B if the distance is not too far. If I have a flat tire on my bike, it's a problem, yes, but I know how to fix it. So it's a simple problem. I'm quite certain how I can fix it. And if I would ask my neighbor, how do I fix my flat tire? He would agree most likely to me how to fix it. So we call that a simple problem. There's agreement between different people. What's the solution? And we're quite certain if we do this, the problem will be solved. A complicated problem, think of constructing a house or making a robot. It is already a bit more complex. We may need different disciplines to build a house or to build a robot, but at the same time, we know we can agree, okay, if you build the walls and I make the roof, we will have a house in the end. It's the division of task, division of skills. But jointly together, we are quite certain if we follow the blueprint, then this is the solution, and this will be the end result. But when we talk about wicked problems, these are complex problems. These are problems where if we do A, we're not entirely sure what the end result will be. Or maybe there is a problem if I think about agriculture, about certain pests and diseases, or about soil degradation. My solution to solve that problem might be different from your solution. And we may even disagree in certain issues that are really complex. So there's less certainty about the right solution to solve the problem. Will that indeed result in the outcome that we want? And there might be disagreement between different people about how to solve that problem. So we need to, it's a bit of a case of a trial and error, negotiation, compromise. We try, we fail, we try again. Because there's so many factors that influence the problem and that might influence also the solution, how effective it will be. So that we really need to look at, okay, what is working, what is not, and we need to monitor it, and we need to perhaps discuss it and come to a joint solution in the end. But it's not always straightforward. So that's why we call it a wicked problem. Maybe to explain this in a slightly different way. So if we have a difficult problem, complicated problem, even though we have a problem as different stakeholders, as different actors, we agree on the priorities. There are maybe a few options that we can choose from, but not too many. We can try option A, option B to solve it. And it's a problem in itself. It's not dependent on the context. So we are not dependent on what's happening around us. If I build a house, well, I build a house. A limited number of people involved who have the knowledge, who have the skills about what needs to be done. And we have a clear time scale. And it's sort of often a bit short term, but we know within that time period we can fix it. But we deal with a wicked problem if priorities are called into questions by different stakeholders, if there are no obvious solutions, if the problems cannot be disentangled from their context, if there are many people involved, and so on. And I think in many countries and also globally, there are currently many issues, global challenges we call them, related to climate change, biodiversity loss, food and nutrition security, conflicts, geopolitics, many health crises, violence. Many of these issues, they are interconnected. They are linked to each other. And there are many people involved, but they do not necessarily agree on what is the core problem or what is the best solution. So in many of these issues that we're dealing with in food systems, they are complex problems where we need to find our way as we go. And if you want to know more about this, in the bottom corner, you see a small picture. It's the Cynefin framework of Snowden. And they explain more the different types of problems and how to distinguish and what is needed to solve them. And perhaps to put it again in another way, you've seen this picture of the elephant before, where you have these people that are blindfolded and they're trying to describe what they are actually touching, what is in front of them, but they cannot see it, they cannot see the whole thing, they only see a part of this system. So one will say, if you only feel the trunk, like it feels like a snake, or if you feel the ears, it's like that's moving, it's like a van, or what is this? Is it a rope? Well, of course, they only see one part of the system, and it's often the same that we have with food systems from our own position or our skills or our expertise. We can only describe one part of that complex food system or complex challenges that we're dealing with. So we need to collaborate, we need to negotiate, we need to communicate to understand the complexity. And only through that, by sharing that collaboration, sharing insights, finding joint solutions, we can move forward. That's the thinking. At the same time, we're not just observers. We are part of the system, as I already said in the beginning. So as soon as we make an action, whether it's small or big, it doesn't matter, we influence the system. Same as these people, it's a static picture, but for sure, if we would do this in real life, the elephant would start moving, right? And suddenly you think, hey, this is something else, it's moving, maybe it's an animal. But it reacts, it responds to what we do. So also in food systems, as soon as we intervene, whether it's with a project or with a new product or a new policy, the food system itself will respond to that. And we need to, again, adjust to that. And this idea is what is called emergence. And emergence, it's a concept, again, something to keep in mind. But yes, on one hand, we have rules, also for the food system. There are, for example, regulatory frameworks on food safety. There are marketing rules. Some are formal rules, some are informal rules, or land rights. But people who act within that system still will deal with those rules differently. And as they interact, there is different responses possible. So think of a game of chess. I don't know if you are a chess player, but there are certain rules to the game, how to play chess. Yet when two people start playing the game, you do not know the end result of that game, who will win, because it depends every move that each player makes, what emerges in that game. And it's the same in a food system. When we recognize a problem and we think we have a solution, we're not sure whether that will happen because actors within the system itself, it will start to respond and things change, things move, and we have to monitor that and respond to that ourselves. Sometimes we compare such a complex system with an iceberg, which you can see here on the picture, where there's always a top of the iceberg in the sea that we might be able to see. And we see certain things also in the food system happening. And we respond to what we see, what we can observe immediately, whether it's soil erosion that we see in a particular area, or we see a shortage on the markets. In Europe, we see problems with pollution because there's too much manure or too much greenhouse gas emissions, and we try to respond to what we see. But actually, what is more important is to look at what's happening underneath the surface. If we look over a timeline, what is the pattern? What is the trend in terms of consumption? What's the trend in terms of soil degradation? What's the trend in terms of prices and so on? That will help us to understand what happened in the past, where are we likely going in the future. But even more importantly is what defines the trend, and that is really the structure underneath how we have constructed the food system. What are the institutions? What are the agreements we have? How have we developed our farming systems? And what is really hard to observe, but what's underneath it all, are the mental models the beliefs that we hold. Do we believe that food is a commodity, and that's more the neoliberal thinking, like we need markets and it's a commodity that we trade, and how can we efficiently produce a commodity? Or is food, for example, a human right? Um, or is it part of our culture, our identity? Depending on how you look at food or a commodity or a right or an identity, you also look differently at how food is being produced, traded, consumed, and so on. And sometimes we are stuck in a certain system because we're stuck in a certain mental model, in a certain belief. And only once we change that thinking, then suddenly the system can change. I can imagine that this is all a bit like, okay, interesting. I want to read more. I want to know more. I think there are more resources available on the learning platform. But now what? How do I apply this? What can I do with this? So for that, we developed a toolbox, which I think is also accessible through the learning platform in this module, to help you think through some of these ideas a bit further, and also give you some methods for what can you do to analyze different parts. And the toolbox is set up in such a way that we said, okay, before you do any analysis, first think about what is the boundary of the food system that I'm looking at. Is it something within a city or within a district or a country? Could be even at an international level, continental, for example. But you need to first have a sort of an idea, like what is the size of the food system, the geographical boundary that I'm looking at. And then for the analysis, we cut it up in 3 major parts. One is, first of all, to look at the actors who's involved in this food system. Who are the main actors that play a role in terms of setting policies, or they have certain activities, or they are affected by what's happening. And there are many different methods that you can use to have a better understanding of the stakeholders that are part of the food system that you look at. The second part in the toolbox is looking at system characteristics. So this is really about understanding what are the main outcomes of this food system, looking at food and nutrition security, environmental issues, socioeconomic issues. And the outcomes can be both positive and negative. So that really depends on your food system that you're considering. And with also, how can you sort of map how different activities, how different drivers, factors are interlinked with some, how can you look at cause and effect and feedback loops and so on. And part 3, system behavior, goes a bit further into that mapping. What are the cause and effect relationships? How can we understand a behavior of a system? And where can we find some points within that whole complex system where we can intervene? When we say, okay, maybe if we change something in this part of the system, it will have an effect, knock-on effect on the other parts, and ultimately on the outcomes that we want to change. And after those 3 major steps in the analysis, then there's a final chapter, like, okay, if we think we have found some entry points to improve the food system, how do we get to action? Now, again, this is not a blueprint. This is not like this is the way to do food system analysis. It's really to give you some ideas, to inspire, and maybe in your circumstances, in your food system, in your context, you can use some of it and you introduce some new elements. That's all fine. In the toolbox, you will find for all those different parts of analysis, you will find different tools, as I said, different methods, and some are quite easy to use. It's to raise awareness. It's to, for example, to facilitate discussions with some stakeholders, or you can go deeper into the issues with exploration tools, or maybe even research and through the analytical tools. But of course, that requires more time, more resources, more capacities. So it really, again, depends on your context, what is suitable for you to use. Then I said the last part is, okay, it's nice to look at a food system perhaps and to do some analysis, but then what? What do we do? So the challenge is to find leverage points for change in the food system where you say, okay, after the analysis, maybe you identified some root causes, and that could be far removed from the symptoms that you observe. Maybe you see that there's an issue with food loss or post-harvest losses because of pests and diseases. But maybe the solution is to improve the advisory services for farmers or to promote more diverse cropping systems rather than applying pesticides, for example. So you try to go to the root causes of the problem. And is there then a solution that is maybe you can use small force, small resources, but nevertheless, through all the knock-on effects of that solution, it will have a larger effect on the whole system and the outcomes. But as I said, it's difficult because we're dealing with wicked problems. We may have to try multiple solutions and see, okay, what causes change, what is not. We may need to try multiple things at the same time to find out which of these many innovations or changes that are possible do take us to the future that we want. But it also depends on what are your mechanisms of influence, depending whether you're a policymaker or an NGO or a business owner, an advisor, a teacher. There are different, you have certain ways that you can influence the system and certain things that are outside your sphere of influence or control, you could say. So maybe in some things you need to collaborate with another stakeholder who can bring something else. And then you try to find out if this is a problem, if we think here we can find a solution in the system. This is what I can bring to the table. That is how you try to explore your intervention area and how can you make a change. A few final thoughts, if I still have some time, just I think it's okay. So a question is often asked, like, why should we use a food system approach? First of all, there are many other approaches. I already mentioned value chain, farming systems. Those are all good approaches. So the food system approach doesn't disqualify any of those other approaches. It just, again, is a different lens we take, a perspective we take to look at a problem, at a difficult challenge that we're facing. So one of the questions I sometimes get is, will a food system analysis or a food system approach, if we apply that, will that result in more impact in our projects or in our policies or in our programs? I cannot say one-on-one, yes, that's always the case. The food system analysis is really to broaden your thinking about the issues that we are facing, the problems we're dealing with, and to get some new perspectives on problems and solutions. And I think the added value is that it helps you to look at the bigger picture, what's happening, to dive a bit deeper into the underlying issues. So not to move too quickly to a solution we think may address the problem when it's not addressing the root causes. It can also help to inform your priority setting or to look at, okay, if you need to decide on where to spend resources, what to prioritize. It can help you to weigh the options. It will also help you to understand some external processes and factors that can either accelerate or oppose the intervention. And these could also be stakeholders who may be able to accelerate or oppose your intervention that you propose. And for those who are familiar with programming, projects, it's really to enrich your theory of change, your impact pathways, if you need to develop one. And more practically, it's also a way to, at the beginning, engage the different stakeholders in jointly defining the problem and to engage them in a decision-making process to come to solutions. So it can also be an instrumental tool to bring people together to discuss the issues, to find joint solutions together. It doesn't mean that you should always use a food system approach. I think if there's a problem and there's a solution and it's obvious to all and everyone agrees, just go ahead, solve it. Or if you can solve it by yourself, also, it's not necessarily needed to do a food system approach analysis first. Or if you do not have the means or the capacity to also act upon it, or if you already know what you will do, but you want to use this analysis only to justify your decision that you already made beforehand, then it's not necessary to use a food system approach. Then I would say maybe spend your resources, your time, your energy on something else. It is really useful, as I said at the beginning, if we have a wicked problem, complex problem, where there's no obvious solutions, where there's disagreement, where we know that the problem is not just standing on itself, but it's connected to other issues that we are also facing, other challenges that we want to address. Some last reflections on food system action. What do we do? How do we implement a food system approach? Or how do we do the analysis? I think it's good to go beyond the usual suspects. If you try to convene the different stakeholders, make sure that the local stakeholders are included in the process, that they have a voice. It's important to work with legitimate local organizations that can take action, that are on the ground to make a difference. It's important to also acknowledge that solutions will have trade-offs. I know politicians often like to talk about win-win-win solutions, but there's always someone who loses, whether it's those that are currently in power or the marginalized. But as soon as something changes, I think there are winners and losers, and it's important to be upfront about it, to recognize that, to recognize tensions, power dynamics that are in play, power differences in power, because it's reality. That is what we have to deal with, and we cannot ignore it. Some good practices that have been assembled over the years by practitioners, by researchers. It's good to create a common vision with the stakeholders, like what do we actually want our food system to look like? What should it deliver? What are the outcomes we are aiming for? What do we agree on? Be explicit about objectives when you start with an intervention. Create ownership as much as you can with all the stakeholders involved. And this does require a lot of effort. Things don't just automatically happen often. Find your friends, the front runners, the change makers, and create a coalition of the willing. There are always champions. There are always people who can influence, who can make a difference. Try to find them and work with them. Be also realistic about your own resources in terms of time, capacities, people, money. What can you do? And what is the mandate or the legitimacy of your organization, for example? Develop an action plan with those stakeholders. And also to keep everyone motivated, including yourself, it's good to look for short-term actions and low-hanging fruit that you can start with, but balance that with a long-term strategy for what you want to achieve in the future. I think I'll leave it at this, Just. Back to you. And for sure, there are some questions.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Helena, for I think a very clear overview of are we talking about when we talk about food systems analysis, and also why is it important to take this whole theory around systems thinking on board in how we analyze food systems. And then we continue with Bram so that we have a bit of time at the end of our session to have a bit of the conversation with the three of us about both of your presentations. So thank you so much, Helena. We'll talk a bit more after Bram's presentation.